On a quiet Sunday morning in March 1945, within the stone walls of a convent kitchen in occupied Poland, a 52-year-old nun named Sister Maria Antonyina stood before a massive iron pot. She stirred a golden vegetable soup, its aroma filling the air with the comforting scent of carrots, potatoes, and celery. Steam rose in lazy spirals. Her hands moved with the practiced rhythm of someone who had prepared 1,000 meals before. But concealed beneath her grey habit, tucked inside a small cloth pouch tied to her waist, lay a vial of rat poison. In less than 2 hours, she would commit one of the most audacious acts of resistance in the history of the Second World War. And then she would vanish into the fog of war, her name erased from nearly every record. Before we go on, if you enjoy these untold stories from history, do consider subscribing. It really helps the channel grow. This was no trained spy. This was no hardened soldier. Sister Maria had spent 30 years in prayer, in silence, in service to God. She had taken vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. She had never fired a weapon, never thrown a grenade, never even raised her voice in anger. Yet on that Sunday morning, she made a decision that would save hundreds of lives and cost her everything. The question isn't whether she did it. The question is how a woman of God convinced herself that mass murder was an act of mercy. To understand, we must rewind 6 years. It's 1939, and the world Sister Maria knew is about to be torn apart. Poland, caught between Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia, is about to become the bloodiest battlefield of the entire war. The convent of the Sacred Heart, in the small town of Posen, had stood for over 2 centuries. It was a place of refuge, of healing, of quiet devotion. The nuns ran a small hospital, a school for orphaned girls, and a soup kitchen that fed the poorest families in town. Sister Maria herself worked in the kitchen, preparing meals for the sick, the hungry, the forgotten. She was known for her gentleness, her humility, and her soup. People said her vegetable soup could cure sadness. When the Wehrmacht rolled into Posen in September 1939, everything changed. The Nazis didn't simply occupy Poland, they tried to erase it. Polish intellectuals were rounded up and shot. Priests were dragged from their churches and sent to concentration camps. Schools were closed, books were burnt, the language itself was banned. And convents, those quiet sanctuaries of faith, were either demolished or repurposed. The convent of the Sacred Heart became something else entirely. The SS, Heinrich Himmler's elite killing machine, transformed it into a rest facility for officers rotating off the Eastern Front. These weren't ordinary soldiers. These were men who had overseen massacres, men who had run the ghettos, men who had signed deportation orders. And now they were sleeping in the same beds where nuns once prayed. Sister Maria and 4 other nuns were allowed to stay, but only under one condition. They would cook and clean for the officers. They would serve meals, wash uniforms stained with blood that wasn't theirs. They would smile and bow and pretend not to hear the stories the officers told over dinner, stories of villages burnt, of families executed, of children left orphaned in the snow. For 5 years, Sister Maria lived in this hell. She watched as the convent she loved became a monument to evil. She listened as the officers laughed about the war, and every single night she prayed for deliverance. But deliverance never came. So she decided to become it herself. The decision to kill didn't arrive in a single moment of clarity. It came slowly, like frost creeping across a window. For 5 years, she had existed in a moral grey zone that would have broken most people. Every morning she woke in a room overlooking the convent courtyard where SS officers conducted drills and inspections. Every afternoon she prepared meals for men who discussed the logistics of genocide, the way other men discussed the weather. Every evening she knelt in the chapel, now stripped of its crucifixes and icons, and asked God for guidance. But the silence from heaven was deafening. The turning point came in January 1945, during one of the coldest winters Poland had ever seen. A group of Jewish prisoners, skeletal and freezing, were marched past the convent on their way to a labor camp. One young woman, no older than 20, collapsed in the snow directly in front of the convent gate. Sister Maria watched from the kitchen window as an SS officer walked over, drew his pistol, and shot the woman in the head. Without hesitation, without emotion, without consequence, he then returned to the convent, sat down at the dining table, and asked Sister Maria for more bread. That night, something inside Maria shattered. She realized that her prayers, her silence, her obedience, were not acts of faith. They were acts of cowardice. She had convinced herself that by staying alive, by serving these men, she was somehow preserving the sanctity of the convent. But the convent was already dead. Its walls had been desecrated, its purpose perverted. The only thing left was the illusion of holiness, and that illusion was keeping 50 murderers fed, rested, and ready to kill again. She thought about the young woman in the snow. She thought about the thousands of others who had died whilst she stirred soup and baked bread, and she made a vow: if God would not intervene, then she would. She would become the instrument of divine justice, even if it cost her soul. If you're finding this fascinating, do hit subscribe. It helps us uncover more stories like this. Sister Maria knew she couldn't act impulsively. The SS officers were not fools. They were paranoid, disciplined, hyper-aware of threats. The convent was under constant surveillance. Every delivery of food was inspected, every visitor questioned. But Sister Maria had one advantage: she was invisible. After 5 years of servitude, the officers no longer saw her as a threat. They saw her as furniture, the old nun who cooked their meals, the harmless woman who kept her head down and her mouth shut. They trusted her in the way men trust a dog. They never imagined she could bite. Over the next 2 months, Sister Maria began to plan. She studied the officers' routines, noting when they gathered in the largest numbers. Sunday lunch emerged as the perfect opportunity. Every Sunday at noon, the officers assembled in the main dining hall for a communal meal. It was a ritual, a tradition meant to boost morale. Attendance was mandatory. All 50 officers stationed at the convent would be present. The meal always began with soup, served family-style in large porcelain tureens. Sister Maria prepared the soup herself, alone in the kitchen, without supervision. It was the one task the Germans never questioned. After all, what harm could an old nun do with vegetables and broth? The final piece of the puzzle was the poison itself. Sister Maria needed something lethal, fast-acting, but not immediately obvious. She couldn't afford for the officers to realize they'd been poisoned before they'd all consumed the soup. Rat poison, specifically a compound called arsenic trioxide, was her answer. It was readily available in the convent basement, used to control the rodent population that thrived in the old stone walls. In small doses, arsenic trioxide caused nausea and stomach cramps. In large doses, it caused organ failure and death. Sister Maria calculated that if she dissolved enough poison into a single batch of soup, and if every officer consumed at least one full bowl, the results would be catastrophic. But the risks were immense. If even one officer suspected foul play, if even one person refused the soup, the entire plan would collapse, and Sister Maria would be executed on the spot. The morning of the second Sunday in March arrived with unseasonable warmth. Snow that had blanketed the convent grounds for months began to melt, creating rivers of mud that snaked through the courtyard. Sister Maria woke before dawn, as she always did, but this morning felt different. Her hands trembled as she dressed. Her heart pounded so loudly she was certain the other nuns could hear it through the thin walls. She descended the stone staircase into the convent kitchen at 5 o'clock in the morning. The room was dark, illuminated only by the faint grey light filtering through a single high window. She lit the oil lamps one by one, their flames casting long shadows across the worn wooden counters. The kitchen smelled of onions and damp stone. She moved through the space with deliberate calm, retrieving ingredients from the pantry. Carrots, potatoes, celery, onions, parsley, vegetable stock. Everything was ordinary. Everything was routine. She filled the massive iron pot with water and set it on the stove to boil. As the water heated, she began chopping vegetables with mechanical precision. Her knife moved in steady rhythms. She had made this soup hundreds of times before. Her body knew the motions by heart. But today, her mind was somewhere else entirely. Today, she was preparing the last meal 50 men would ever eat. By 9 o'clock in the morning, the soup was nearly complete. The vegetables had softened. The broth had thickened into a rich golden liquid that filled the kitchen with a comforting aroma. It looked perfect. It smelled perfect. Now came the moment she had been dreading. She reached into the folds of her habit and retrieved the small glass vial she had hidden there. Inside was a fine white powder, arsenic trioxide. She had measured it carefully the night before, using an old apothecary scale she'd found in the convent infirmary. Too little and the officers would merely become ill. Too much, and the poison might leave a detectable taste or texture. Sister Maria's hands shook as she unscrewed the vial. She paused, staring at the white powder. This was the point of no return. Once the poison entered the soup, there would be no way to undo what she was about to do. She thought about her vows. She thought about the commandment she was about to violate. Thou shalt not kill. But then she thought about another commandment. Thou shalt not stand idly by whilst thy neighbour's blood is shed. She thought about the Jewish woman in the snow. She thought about the villages burnt to ash. She thought about the children who would never grow old. And she poured the poison into the soup. The powder dissolved instantly, vanishing into the golden broth without a trace. She stirred the pot slowly, ensuring the poison was evenly distributed. Then she stepped back, crossed herself, and whispered a prayer not for forgiveness, but for strength. At 11:30, the officers began arriving in the dining hall. Sister Maria could hear their boots echoing through the corridors, their voices loud and jovial. They were in good spirits. Rumour had spread that the war would be over soon, and many believed they would be reassigned to cushy administrative posts in Berlin. They had no idea that in 30 minutes they would be dead. Sister Maria ladled the soup into porcelain tureens, her face a mask of serene calm. She carried the tureens into the dining hall on a wooden cart, setting them on the long oak table where the officers sat. They barely acknowledged her presence. To them, she was just the old nun, the invisible servant. One officer waved his hand impatiently, signalling for her to hurry. Another made a crude joke about the soup being the only good thing about this god-forsaken convent. Sister Maria said nothing. She simply bowed her head and returned to the kitchen. And then she waited. A quick note if you're enjoying this. Subscribing really does make a difference. Now, back to the story. Sister Maria stood in the kitchen doorway, hidden in the shadows, watching through a narrow crack as the officers began their meal. The dining hall was alive with noise. Laughter echoed off the high stone walls. Silverware clinked against porcelain. Wine glasses were raised in toasts to the fatherland, to victory, to survival. The soup was served in waves. The first tureen was emptied within minutes. The officers praised the flavour, calling it the best batch Sister Maria had ever made. One young lieutenant, barely 25 years old, asked for a second bowl, then a third. Sister Maria felt something she couldn't quite name. Was it guilt, regret, or simply the recognition that this young man, who might have been someone's son, someone's brother, had chosen to wear the uniform of monsters? The officers continued eating, oblivious to the fate already coursing through their bloodstreams. Arsenic is a cruel poison. It doesn't kill instantly. It works slowly, methodically, attacking the digestive system first, then spreading to the kidneys, the liver, the heart. The first symptoms, nausea and stomach cramps, can take anywhere from 30 minutes to 2 hours to appear. Sister Maria had timed everything perfectly. At 1:45, the first officer began to feel ill. It was the same young lieutenant who had eaten 3 bowls. He stood abruptly from the table, his face pale, his hand pressed against his stomach. He muttered something about needing air and stumbled towards the door. The other officers barely noticed. But within 10 minutes, another officer stood, then another, then 3 more. The dining hall, which had been so loud and chaotic just moments before, began to quiet. The laughter faded. The toasts stopped. Officers looked at each other with confusion, then concern, then fear. One officer vomited violently onto the floor. Another collapsed against the wall, clutching his chest. Panic spread like wildfire. Sister Maria retreated deeper into the kitchen, her back pressed against the cold stone wall. She could hear the chaos unfolding, the screams, the retching, the sound of bodies hitting the floor. She closed her eyes and prayed. Not for the officers, but for herself. She prayed that God would understand. She prayed that this act, this unforgivable sin, would somehow be weighed against the lives she had saved. By 1:15, the dining hall had descended into complete pandemonium. Officers were sprawled across the floor, convulsing, vomiting blood, gasping for air. Medical personnel arrived, but there was nothing they could do. Arsenic poisoning has no antidote. The damage was irreversible. Some officers died within hours. Others lingered for days, their organs shutting down one by one. In total, 47 of the 50 officers who ate the soup that Sunday died. 3 survivors had arrived late to lunch and consumed only small amounts. They would live, but they would carry the scars of that day for the rest of their lives. And Sister Maria, the quiet nun who had served them faithfully for 5 years, vanished without a trace. The moment Sister Maria heard the first screams echo through the convent walls, she knew her life as she had known it was over. There would be no returning to the quiet rhythms of prayer and service. There would be no forgiveness from the SS. There would be no mercy. The Nazis had a policy for acts of resistance, especially acts committed by those they considered subhuman Poles, Jews, clergy. The punishment was always the same: public execution, torture first if time permitted, and not just for the perpetrator, but for anyone associated with them. The other nuns in the convent would be lined up against the courtyard wall and shot. The entire town of Posen might be subjected to collective punishment, homes burnt, families deported. Sister Maria understood this. She had always understood this, which is why she had prepared for this moment as carefully as she had prepared the soup itself. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard in her small sleeping quarters was a cloth bundle. Inside were civilian clothes, a forged identity card, a small amount of Polish currency, and a hand-drawn map of escape routes leading west towards the Allied lines. Sister Maria had been preparing this escape kit for months, piecing it together bit by bit with the help of a local resistance contact who visited the convent under the guise of delivering supplies. The resistance had known about her plan, not the specifics, but enough. They had offered to help her disappear once the deed was done. All she had to do was reach the rendezvous point, an abandoned farmhouse 3 kilometers north of the convent, by nightfall. It sounded simple. It was anything but. She moved quickly, but deliberately. She changed out of her nun's habit and into the plain grey dress and headscarf she had hidden. She tucked the forged identity card into her pocket. The card identified her as Maria Kowalski, a widowed seamstress from Krakow. It wasn't much, but it might buy her a few precious seconds if she was stopped. She avoided the main corridors, instead navigating the convent's hidden passageways, the ones only the nuns knew about. These tunnels had been built centuries ago, when convents were fortresses as much as places of worship. They connected the sleeping quarters to the chapel to the kitchen to the cellar, and the cellar, Sister Maria knew, had a forgotten drainage tunnel that led outside the convent walls. She descended into the cellar, her footsteps silent on the stone stairs. Above her, she could hear boots pounding through the hallways, voices shouting orders. The Germans were conducting a full sweep of the convent, searching for the person responsible. She reached the far corner of the cellar, where old wooden crates and barrels were stacked against the wall. Behind them was the entrance to the drainage tunnel. She pulled the crates aside, revealing a narrow opening barely wide enough for a person to crawl through. The air that rushed out was dank and foul, thick with the smell of mildew and rot. Sister Maria didn't hesitate. She dropped to her hands and knees and crawled into the darkness. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever. The walls were slick with moisture and algae. Jagged stones tore at her dress and scraped her knees. She could hear water dripping somewhere in the distance, echoing in the confined space. Her breath came in short, shallow gasps. But she kept moving forwards, inch by inch, driven by a single thought: survive. Survive long enough to make sure the world knows what happened here. After what felt like an eternity, she saw it. A faint circle of daylight ahead. The exit. She crawled faster, ignoring the pain in her knees, ignoring the blood she could feel soaking through her dress. And then she was out. She emerged into a ditch on the far side of the convent grounds, hidden from view by overgrown bushes and tall grass. She lay there for a moment, gasping for air, her body trembling, but she didn't allow herself to rest. She stood, brushed the dirt from her clothes, and began walking north towards the farmhouse, towards freedom, towards a future she wasn't sure she deserved. If you've stayed with us this far, you're exactly the kind of viewer we make these for. Please do subscribe. The 3-kilometer journey to the farmhouse should have taken less than an hour under normal circumstances, but these were not normal circumstances. Sister Maria was a 52-year-old woman who had spent the last 3 decades in near total isolation from the outside world. She had no survival training, no weapons, no experience navigating hostile territory. And the countryside between the convent and the rendezvous point was crawling with German patrols. The roads were too dangerous to use, so she stuck to the fields and forests, moving in a zigzag pattern to avoid open ground. Her legs ached, her lungs burnt. Every sound made her freeze in place, convinced that she had been discovered. The snap of a twig, the distant bark of a dog, the rumble of a lorry engine on the nearby highway, each one sent adrenaline flooding through her body. Twice she had to hide. The first time was when a German patrol vehicle passed along a dirt road just 50 meters from where she crouched behind a fallen tree. She pressed herself flat against the cold mud, barely breathing, as 2 SS soldiers stepped out to relieve themselves. They stood there for what felt like an eternity, smoking cigarettes and talking casually about their plans for the evening. Sister Maria could see the death's head insignia on their caps. She could hear every word they said. One of them joked about the poisoning back at the convent, calling it poetic justice for eating nun food. The other laughed. They had no idea that the woman responsible was less than a stone's throw away. The second time was worse. As she approached the edge of a small forest, she heard voices, German voices, close. She dove into a thicket of bushes, thorns tearing at her skin, and watched as an entire SS unit marched past. There were at least 20 soldiers, heavily armed, moving with grim determination. They were heading south towards the convent, towards the scene of the crime. Sister Maria realized with growing horror that this was a special response team. The kind of unit the Nazis deployed when they wanted to make an example. When they wanted to send a message. She thought about the other nuns still inside the convent. She thought about the town of Posen, and she felt the weight of her decision pressing down on her like a physical force. By the time Sister Maria reached the abandoned farmhouse, the sun was beginning to set. The sky had turned a bruised purple, streaked with orange and red. The farmhouse itself was exactly as the resistance contact had described, a collapsing 2-story structure with a caved-in roof and walls blackened by fire. It had been destroyed during the initial German invasion in 1939 and left to rot. Sister Maria approached cautiously, scanning the surrounding area for any signs of ambush. Satisfied that she was alone, she slipped inside through a gap in the wall. The interior was dark and smelled of charred wood and decay. In the far corner, partially hidden beneath a collapsed beam, was a wooden crate. Her heart leapt. The resistance had been here. She pulled the crate free and prized it open. Inside were supplies, bread, dried meat, a canteen of water, a wool blanket, and a note written in Polish. It read simply, "Stay here until dark. Someone will come for you. Do not light a fire. Do not make noise. Trust no one." Sister Maria sank to the floor, her body finally giving in to exhaustion. She ate a piece of bread, drank some water, and wrapped herself in the blanket. For the first time since that morning, she allowed herself to cry. Not out of fear, not out of regret, but out of sheer, overwhelming relief. She had done it. She had poisoned 50 SS officers and escaped. But she knew the hardest part was still ahead. She had to survive long enough to tell the world what she had done. And she had to live with the knowledge that she had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Sister Maria woke to the sound of footsteps crunching through broken glass. Her eyes snapped open, her body instantly alert despite the exhaustion. The farmhouse was pitch black. She couldn't see anything, but she could hear everything. Slow, deliberate footsteps. More than one person. They were inside the building. Then a voice cut through the darkness. A woman's voice, speaking Polish with a rural accent. The voice said her name, not Sister Maria, but her real name, the name she had been born with 52 years ago, before she had taken her vows. The voice said, "Maria Antonyina Wisniewska, we are friends. We are here to take you home." The resistance fighters who entered the farmhouse were not what Sister Maria had expected. There were 3 of them, 2 men and 1 woman. None of them looked like soldiers. The woman was in her 40s, dressed in peasant clothes, her face worn and weathered. One of the men was older, perhaps 60, with a limp and a scar across his cheek. The other was barely more than a boy, 18 at most, with frightened eyes that darted constantly towards the door. The older man introduced himself as Piotr. He explained that they were part of a larger network that had been operating in the region since the beginning of the occupation. They had safe houses scattered throughout the countryside, routes into the forests, contacts in the cities. Their job was to smuggle people out of Poland, Jews, Allied pilots, resistance fighters. And now, a nun who had just committed one of the most audacious acts of sabotage in the entire war. Piotr told Sister Maria what had happened after she escaped. The SS had discovered the bodies within an hour. They had immediately sealed off the convent and begun interrogations. The remaining nuns were questioned for hours, but they genuinely knew nothing. The Germans eventually concluded that Sister Maria had acted alone, which saved the other sisters from execution. But the town of Posen was not so fortunate. In retaliation for the deaths of the 47 officers, the SS rounded up 200 male civilians from the surrounding area and shot them in the town square. It was collective punishment, a tactic designed to discourage further resistance. Sister Maria felt her stomach turn. 200 innocent men dead because of her. Piotr saw the look on her face and shook his head. He told her that those deaths were not her fault. They were the fault of the men who created a system where such punishments were possible. He told her that the officers she killed were responsible for far more than 200 deaths. They were responsible for thousands, tens of thousands, and if she had done nothing, they would have continued killing until the very end. But Sister Maria wasn't sure she believed him. She wasn't sure she could ever believe him. Piotr didn't give her much time to dwell on it. He explained that they needed to move immediately. The SS was conducting sweeps of every farmhouse, every barn, every abandoned building within 10 kilometers of the convent. They were using dogs, informants, collaborators. If Sister Maria stayed here any longer, she would be caught. The plan was simple, but dangerous. They would travel only at night, moving west through a series of safe houses until they reached the front lines. The Red Army was advancing rapidly from the east, and the British and Americans were pushing in from the west. Germany was caught in a vice. The war would be over soon. Everyone could feel it, but the final weeks were often the most brutal. The journey west became a blur of frozen fields, abandoned villages, and near misses with death. Sister Maria and her 3 protectors moved like ghosts through a landscape that had been shattered by 6 years of war. They traveled only between midnight and dawn, when the darkness provided cover but also concealed 1,000 dangers. They slept in root cellars, in the attics of sympathetic farmers, in forests so dense that sunlight barely penetrated the canopy. Sister Maria's body, already weakened by years of deprivation at the convent, began to fail. Her feet blistered and bled. Her lungs rattled with every breath, but she never complained. She never asked to stop, because she knew that stopping meant dying, and she refused to die before her story was told. On the 7th night, they encountered a German patrol. It happened just outside a small village, whose name Sister Maria never learnt. They were crossing an open field, moving in single file, when the beam of a torch swept across the darkness. Someone shouted in German, "Halt!" The resistance fighters reacted instantly. Piotr grabbed Sister Maria and pulled her to the ground. The young boy, whose name was Jacob, drew a pistol from his coat. The woman, whose name was Christina, motioned for everyone to stay silent. The German patrol consisted of 4 soldiers, all of them young, all of them exhausted. They were Wehrmacht, not SS regular army, conscripts probably, who wanted nothing more than to survive the war and go home. They approached cautiously, their rifles raised but not aimed. Piotr stood slowly, hands visible, and began speaking in broken German. He told them he was a farmer returning home with his family. He told them they had been visiting relatives in the next town. He told them they had papers. The German soldiers didn't believe him. Sister Maria could see it in their eyes. One of them, a sergeant with a scar on his chin, demanded to see the papers. Piotr reached into his coat slowly, carefully, and produced a set of forged documents. The sergeant examined them under the beam of his torch. He looked at Piotr, then at Christina, then at Jacob, and finally at Sister Maria. His eyes lingered on her face. She looked away, terrified that he would see through the disguise, that he would recognize her as the nun from the convent. The sergeant asked her a question in German. She didn't understand. Christina quickly intervened, explaining in German that Sister Maria was deaf and mute, a childhood illness. The sergeant stared at Sister Maria for a long moment. Then he looked back at Piotr, and he did something unexpected. He handed the papers back and told them to go quickly, before his commanding officer arrived. Sister Maria didn't understand what had just happened until they were a kilometer away. Piotr explained that the sergeant had seen through their story, but had chosen to let them go anyway. It happened sometimes, especially this late in the war. Soldiers who were tired of killing, soldiers who no longer believed in the cause, soldiers who simply wanted the nightmare to end. The sergeant could have arrested them. He could have called for reinforcements. But instead, he had given them a chance. Sister Maria wondered if he knew who she was, if word of the poisoning had spread beyond the SS, if he had looked at her and seen not a fugitive, but a symbol of something larger, an act of defiance that even some Germans could respect. She would never know. But for the first time since she had poured the poison into the soup, she felt something other than guilt. She felt a flicker of hope. By the 14th night, they reached the front lines. The sky glowed orange on the horizon, lit by burning villages and exploding ammunition depots. The resistance fighters led Sister Maria to the edge of a dense forest, where the trees had been shredded by shrapnel and the ground was pocked with craters. Piotr pointed towards a distant ridge. Beyond that ridge, he said, were British forces. They had advanced rapidly in the past week and were now holding a defensive line along a river. If Sister Maria could cross the ridge and reach the river, she would be safe. But she would have to go alone. The resistance fighters couldn't risk crossing into Allied territory. They had work to do, people to save, a country to rebuild. Piotr handed Sister Maria a white cloth and told her to wave it as she approached the British lines. He told her to shout that she was a refugee, that she was Polish, that she needed help, and then he hugged her. It was brief, awkward, but filled with a respect that words could not convey. Christina and Jacob said their goodbyes as well. And then they disappeared back into the forest, leaving Sister Maria alone at the edge of freedom. Sister Maria stood at the edge of the forest for a long time, staring at the ridge that separated her from safety. The white cloth hung limp in her hand. Her legs trembled with exhaustion. Every part of her body screamed for rest. But she knew that if she stopped now, if she allowed herself to collapse, she might never get up again. So she began walking, one foot in front of the other. The terrain was brutal. The ground had been churned by tank tracks and artillery shells, transforming what had once been farmland into a muddy wasteland. Craters filled with stagnant water dotted the landscape. Twisted metal, the remains of destroyed vehicles, jutted from the earth like broken bones. The air smelt of smoke and chemicals. And everywhere there was silence, a terrible, oppressive silence that seemed to swallow all sound. Halfway up the ridge, Sister Maria stumbled and fell. Her hands plunged into cold mud. She tried to stand, but her legs wouldn't cooperate. Her vision blurred. She realized, with a detached kind of clarity, that she was dying. Her body had reached its limit. 2 weeks of walking through frozen nights, 2 weeks of barely eating, 2 weeks of fear and adrenaline and guilt had drained every reserve she had. She lay there in the mud, staring up at the grey sky, and thought about the soup. She thought about the officers collapsing in the dining hall. She thought about the 200 civilians executed in retaliation. She thought about the young German sergeant who had let her go. And she thought about the young woman who had been shot in the snow. All of it swirled together in her mind, a chaotic tapestry of violence and mercy, of sin and salvation. And that would have to be enough. Then she heard voices. English voices. She forced her eyes open and saw figures approaching soldiers in khaki uniforms. British troops. They were shouting at her, but she couldn't make out the words. One of them knelt beside her, checking for wounds. Another was speaking into a radio. Sister Maria tried to lift the white cloth, tried to wave it, but her arm wouldn't move. The soldier leaning over her said something in English. She shook her head and responded in Polish. "I am a refugee. I need help." The soldier didn't understand. He called over another man, someone who spoke a little Polish. Sister Maria repeated herself. "I am Polish. I escaped from the Germans. I need to tell someone what I did." The translator relayed this to the others. There was confusion, questions, but they didn't interrogate her. They simply lifted her onto a stretcher and began carrying her down the other side of the ridge, towards the Allied lines, towards safety, towards a future she hadn't allowed herself to imagine. Sister Maria spent 3 weeks in a British field hospital, recovering from malnutrition, pneumonia, and exposure. The nurses marveled at the fact that she had survived at all. Most refugees who arrived in her condition didn't make it through the first night. But Sister Maria was stubborn. She clung to life with the same determination that had carried her through the drainage tunnel, through the forests, through the frozen fields, and when she was finally strong enough to speak, she told her story. She told it to a British intelligence officer who had been assigned to interview refugees for information about German positions and troop movements. But when Sister Maria described what she had done at the convent, the officer stopped taking notes. He stared at her in disbelief. He asked her to repeat herself. She did, and he realized he was sitting across from a woman who had single-handedly killed more Nazi officers than some entire resistance cells. The British officer wanted to publicize her story immediately. He saw the propaganda value. A nun who poisoned 50 SS officers. It was the kind of story that could boost morale, inspire resistance movements, demonstrate that even the most unlikely people could strike back against tyranny. But Sister Maria refused. She didn't want to be a hero. She didn't want to be a symbol. She wanted to disappear. She wanted to live out the rest of her days in quiet obscurity, praying for the souls of the men she had killed and the innocents who had died because of her actions. The British officer argued with her, but ultimately, he respected her wishes. He filed a classified report detailing her account, stamped it secret, and locked it away. And Sister Maria, the woman who had committed one of the most audacious acts of resistance in the entire war, faded into history. Her name appeared in no newspapers. Her face appeared in no photographs. For decades, the world had no idea she had ever existed. After the war ended in May 1945, Sister Maria Antonyina was offered resettlement in England. The British government had programs for displaced persons, especially those who had aided the Allied cause. She could have started a new life, a quiet life, but she declined. Instead, she returned to Poland, not to Posen, which had been devastated by the final battles of the war, but to a small convent in the countryside near Krakow. It was a different order, a different community, but the rhythms were the same. Prayer, work, silence. She took her vows again, reclaiming the identity she had abandoned when she poured poison into that soup. For the next 32 years, until her death in 1977 at the age of 84, Sister Maria lived as she had before the war. She cooked meals. She tended gardens. She prayed for forgiveness. And she never spoke about what she had done. Not to the other nuns, not to the priests, not to anyone. The secret died with her, or so everyone thought. In 1991, 16 years after the fall of communism in Poland, a historian named Dr. Tomasz Lewandowski was researching Nazi war crimes in occupied Poland. He was digging through declassified British intelligence files when he stumbled upon a report dated April 1945. The report described an incident at a convent in Posen where 47 SS officers had been poisoned by a nun. The report included her real name, her age, and a brief account of her escape. Dr. Lewandowski was stunned. He had never heard of this incident. It wasn't in any history books, wasn't in any archives. He began investigating, tracking down survivors, searching through church records, interviewing elderly Poles who had lived through the occupation. And slowly, piece by piece, he reconstructed Sister Maria's story. He published his findings in a Polish historical journal in 1993. The article caused a sensation in Poland but barely made a ripple internationally. The world was focused on other things: the Gulf War, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Rwandan genocide. The story of a nun who had poisoned Nazis half a century earlier seemed like ancient history. But here's why Sister Maria's story matters today. In an age where we are constantly told that violence solves nothing, that resistance is futile, that ordinary people can't make a difference, Sister Maria proves otherwise. She was not a soldier, she was not a spy. She was a 52-year-old woman who had spent 3 decades in prayer and service. And yet, when confronted with absolute evil, she acted. She didn't wait for permission. She didn't wait for orders. She didn't wait for someone else to save the day. She took the tools, she had a pot of soup and a vial of poison, and she struck back. She killed 47 men who had participated in genocide, men who would have continued killing if she had done nothing. And yes, there were consequences. 200 innocent civilians were executed in retaliation. Sister Maria carried that guilt for the rest of her life. But she also carried the knowledge that those 47 officers would never kill again, that the families they would have destroyed were spared, that the villages they would have burnt were saved. The reason you've never heard Sister Maria's story isn't because it didn't happen. It's because it doesn't fit the narrative, history, as it's taught in schools, as it's presented in documentaries, as it's commemorated in monuments, tends to focus on big moments: D-Day, Pearl Harbor, the fall of Berlin. But the truth is, wars are not won by grand gestures alone. They are won by 1,000 small acts of defiance, by a farmer hiding a Jewish family in his barn, by a factory worker sabotaging assembly lines, by a nun poisoning soup. These stories are harder to tell because they're messy. They force us to confront uncomfortable questions about when violence is justified, about what ordinary people are capable of, about the cost of resistance. So these stories get buried, they get classified, they get forgotten. And people like Sister Maria, who risked everything to fight back, fade into obscurity. But not anymore. You now know the truth. You know that on a Sunday morning in March 1945, a woman of God became an angel of death. You know that she saved lives by taking lives. You know that she escaped through a drainage tunnel, crossed enemy lines on foot, and survived to tell her tale, only to choose silence. And you know that her story, like so many stories of resistance, was deliberately erased from history. Sister Maria didn't wait for a hero, she became one, and the world, whether it acknowledges it or not, is better because she existed.